And welcome to Paper of the Week. It's Steve Eddy here talking about the paper of the week. And I've got 1.5 papers today because there's a little bit of a graph of another one that I want to talk about. So what we're going to be talking about today is basically inflammatory bowel disease. Now, what inflammatory bowel disease, and there's a group of them, is basically when the colon or the bowel becomes inflamed. There are two main types of inflammatory bowel disease that you've probably heard of. One's called Crohn's disease and one's called ulcerative colitis. This paper talks about ulcerative colitis. Now, the million-dollar question is, what is ulcerative colitis? Well, what causes it? Well, there are four main causes to it in this particular paper here that we can show a bit later. And the four main causes are environmental factors. So something that stress or smoking, in fact, smoking inhibits inflammatory bowel disease just as an intricide. So they used to use it as a treatment for inflammatory bowel disease. Autoimmunity is a big product. So there is some autoimmune component to it. In other words, that's when the immune system attacks the colon in this case. There is also a genetic component where people have to have certain genes, and those certain genes, of course, can make you susceptible to ulcerative colitis. And of course, and what we're going to mainly talk about today is the gut microbiome. That is the fourth factor that can drive ulcerative colitis. Now, this is interesting because in medicine, we treat inflammatory bowel disease with anti-inflammatories. The most common one given is 40 milligrams of prednisolone, cortisone, whatever you want to call it, and that's taken orally, and that's a classic treatment for inflammatory bowel disease, and it works very, very well to reduce inflammation. Unfortunately, it has side effects, quite severe ones, in fact, and there was a paper published in Nature showing that it can increase breast cancers, and that was only last week. We could have done that as paper of the week, but this is more positive. So another treatment for it is antibiotics that don't get absorbed very well. One of the classic ones is vancomycin, and metronidazole is another one. So these antibiotics are given to people with ulcerative colitis. That's a good treatment too. Another treatment is drugs like sulfasalazine, which is a classic drug that's used for inflammatory bowel diseases. Now, these are all great drugs and they all work in their own certain way. But it's very interesting because firstly, that won't change your environmental factors. It won't change your genetics. And will it change your gut microbiome? Question mark. The antibiotics will, of course, but how they do it is interesting. And autoimmunity, well, cortisone suppresses the immune system, so that's how it works with autoimmunity. So this paper is apt titled, "The Gut Microbiome as a Target for Inflammatory Bowel Disease. Are we there yet?" And that's the million-dollar question. And to answer that question, I think the answer is yes. And the paper concludes that. And the paper talks about some very interesting points when it comes to the gut and the microbiome in the gut. Basically, there's been a lot of studies now done on fecal transplants. And yes, it's exactly how it sounds. You take your poop from a healthy individual and put it in someone that is unhealthy, and basically it helps them. And that's fecal transplant. So what they're in fact doing in in fecal transplant therapy is they're taking the bugs from a healthy person and putting them in the bugs of an unhealthy person, and it improves them. There's no question about that. So very interesting. Now, obviously at ATP Science, we look at the gut bugs as a different way. And this is where, and I don't want this to turn into a product vlog, but basically the gut right, which is its modbiotic effect, so it actually kills the bad bugs and support the growth of the good ones, is a much more healthy way of doing that instead of swallowing someone else's fecal matter, however you put it. So, the studies find that of course, when you give probiotics, it's hit and miss because you may not be deficient in that particular probiotic. So, of course, it's an autoimmune disease because the gut microbiome there's trillions of bugs in the gut, and the immune system is hanging out there. And if you've got the wrong bugs, the immune system becomes fired up and inflammatory, and it drives up T helper 1 and T helper 9 and T helper 17. They're the autoimmune T helper cells, and they trigger off an autoimmune disease. And most autoimmune disease fall into one of those, or most of those categories of T helper excesses. So you get too much of the immune system because you've got too many bad bugs in the gut. as I said, Gut Right will help eliminate those. So the other way, of course, is by taking powerfully anti-inflammatory drugs just to settle down the inflammation. Doesn't address the cause. You haven't got ulcerative colitis because you're deficient in corticosteroids. So this paper talks about basically manipulating the gut microbiome in the treatment of inflammatory bowel disease. And this is a beautiful title here. Now they use antibiotics, and that's fine, but that's like a shotgun. That's not natural, has side effects, and it kills all sorts of things in the bugs, and really has some problematic side effects. So this is where we need to treat the gut microbiome, and we can modify the gut microbiome in such a way to make it more healthy. This is where natural medicine is ahead of medicine. Now, of course, there is also a low reactive diet, which comes along here too. So no gluten, no dairy, and any other food you react to. They're the two you get rid of first. So you've really got to sort of treat this as an autoimmune food intolerance, basically, gut microbiome, genetic disease. You can't change the genes, but you can change the other factors. So this paper talks about that, yes, we are there yet. The microbiome has a lot to do with the health of your colon, and modifying that is a key way of doing it. The two ways we can use, of course, fecal transplant, you know what that is, or Gut Right, and that's what Gut Right is really formulated for. So this has been Paper of the Week, and I hope we've introduced you to a terrible condition called ulcerative colitis, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks.